Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
Well, I can't wait to read your book.
That's very kind.
And I have two questions, one to do with tariqa. But the first one is, you said you initially intended to have two versions of this, one for private tariqa use and one for a wider audience. What is the actual hope? What is the hope and the purpose of this book in the wider world? What is the statement that it's trying to make? And then the question about tariqa is really, you mentioned that it's quite eclectic. And actually it's very fascinating to me because I wasn't aware just how multi-tariqa the elements are. What, in your personal opinion, does this say about the future of tariqas as a whole?
It's very good questions, thank you. So the first, in terms of statement, so a lot of, I think, the existing literature on tariqas in English, and there will be an Arabic version of this hopefully coming out next year, I think has been very beneficial, but I never saw anything that really covered the tariqah of this particular tradition. Sayyid Muhammad bin Ali al-Maliki is very well known as a great scholar in the Muslim world. He was known as a scholar's scholar, actually. Even though he died very young, he died in his early 50s. And yet, over the span of, maybe 2 or 3 decades, he became extremely popular and very, very widely respected. One way to see that is he actually collected some of his ijazas, or asanid rather, some of his asanid, his chains of transmission, into a couple of books. And they're books. They're literally books. And they're not books because the asanid are going from him back to the Prophet ﷺ. It's the names of the individual people that he took from. Okay? And he mentions their countries and their where they're from. And they're literally from all around the Muslim world, sometimes including figures that I know personally were loggerheads with each other. Okay, and different followings like Deobandis and Barelwis, they're in the same book. So he was a very phenomenal scholar. And yet, many didn't quite realize that he was also a murabbi. He was also a trainer of souls. He was also a murshid in tariqah. He was a guide in a Sufi path. And I'm not sure, it's interesting as to why that might be the case. It's certainly something that I saw in the Zawiya in Cape Town itself. It's called the Zawiya, but it's a mosque, right? So people say Masjid al-Zawiya. They don't necessarily regard it as a Sufi Zawiya. It's just the name of the place. And it's actually a waqf for the family. And I remember people saying that, there are thousands of murids. And I was very confused because it didn't seem like they were murids in what I had been led to believe was the case. It seemed rather that they simply came to the mosque. But that was the way in which the tradition developed in South Africa. And you find that a lot in Southeast Asia as well, where people will say, we're affiliated to this tariqah. I say, oh, okay, so which sheikh did you give bay'ah to? I say, what are you talking about? Like, well, we don't know what you mean. Because that's the way in which it developed, and there are different levels of intisab, different levels of connection that exist. So I just found all of that quite interesting. And there were certain principles that were actually very general, i.e. they didn't just apply to this particular tariqah, but they applied to the subject of Sufism more generally. And I thought that would be good to put down on paper, as did obviously the sheikhs that wrote it. In terms of the future, I don't know how much it says about the future, to be honest, because it's not a new phenomenon. So it's not, you could argue, oh, it's something new, so maybe this will change things in the future. I don't think that's the case. I think it's actually very old. It's quite, I find it unique, but I find it unique because of what Mecca actually represents, in that there are very few places in the Muslim world where you had this broad range of different types of religious scholarship coalesce, right? Because of the Hajj. So you will find that mix in Mecca that you won't find really anywhere else in the same way. As somebody who's partly Egyptian, any Egyptians in the crowd? مصريين فين؟ يلا يا أشرف يعني. Okay, so there's one. I count your kids in that, by the way. People like to say that because of the Azhar, Egypt has some of that kind of flavor as well. But, Mecca is very special in that regard. And because the people that came to Mecca, as all Muslims are obliged to do, many of them were of this immense spiritual pedigree. So one could argue, and we mentioned this in the book, that they were like mujtahids in tariqah. They were like independent authorities in tariqah, and they came together in a very particular way that probably wouldn't have been possible otherwise. So yeah, does that answer your question?